Looking back at 2016, many of us see this as a hinge point in history, the moment when the post-war liberal order, the order created by America with institutions like the United Nations, the NATO alliance, when this system, if you like, began to break down. Is that the way you see it, or are we just exaggerating?
Well, I've just come back from Washington, and I think a lot of people there do worry that that is the case. Of course, it's all to do with the election of Donald Trump, which has kind of rounded their year off and is a kind of revolution, because this is a man who ran both against the Republican establishment and the Democratic establishment and introduced a whole new style of politics to the United States, much more kind of populist, aggressive. But also, if you look at what Trump is promising to do, if he carries it through, then I think what you're talking about, the end of the Western liberal order, is kind of in sight, because there are two things in particular I'd point to. That order is based on two basic bedrock American commitments. The first is to open trade, and Trump is an explicitly protectionist candidate and now president. And the second is to the American alliance system, which underpins security all over the world. And then again, Trump has called the NATO alliance obsolete. He's questioned America's alliances with Japan and South Korea. If he carries that through, then yes, I think you can say the order's crumbling.
How do we decide whether what Trump's words will translate in action? Or do you think that Mr. Trump, once he gets into the White House, will prove to be a different kind of president?
Well, I think he will certainly be a different kind of president. The question is whether he follows through coherent policies. I mean, I think you would look at things like tariffs and protectionism. Does he follow through on promises to slap tariffs on Chinese, Japanese goods? There's even talk of an import tax being going through Congress. These would be huge changes in American policy. There's already been one significant change, which is he's pulled America out of the plan for a trans-Pacific trade partnership.
Yeah, I think that for me was actually probably one of the most important moves, because the Trans-Pacific Partnership is not just a trade deal, it's a piece of geopolitical architecture. It reinforces ties with the Southeast Pacific nations and particularly Japan.
Yeah, and I think that
leaves the door open for China.
Absolutely, and that's, I think, how the that's how the Clinton people and Obama people saw it. They saw it as a way of getting America back into the game. And I think the whole background to this is that in 2014, the IMF announced that China, at least according to purchasing power parity, is now the world's largest economy. So things were already shaking in that global liberal order that you mentioned, because that was based on the idea of Western predominance, and now you have China rising. And the TPP was terribly important to America's effort to kind of make sure that America remains central to the Asia-Pacific economy, which is the core of the global economy now. And so for Trump to say, well, actually, I'm not going to do it, is a huge blow to the whole way America's been trying to manage its position in the world.
And it's worth pointing out, before we go back to Trump, Mr. Trump, the personality, it's worth pointing out that China itself has been creating new institutions, if you like, to counterbalance that US-led order. So the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank set up, and also wanting a bigger say in the IMF.
Yeah, and I think that one of the interesting things was in the early Chinese reaction to Trump, you saw almost a Chinese effort to take on some of the roles the Americans have been playing, which is the protector of global public goods. So the Chinese ended up warning Trump not to ditch the global climate change agreement. When he said, well, we're not going to do the TPP, the Chinese said, well, maybe we can have a free trade area in Asia Pacific built around China. And now you have Xi Jinping going to Davos, which Trump certainly will not be doing in the first month of this year, which again is a gathering of the global elite. And for the
January
Chinese,
2017.
Yeah, and for the Chinese to be there and the Americans not to be is quite interesting.
Let's just go back to Donald Trump, the personality. One of the things that struck me, and I've seen written about 4 or 5 presidential elections, was the degree to which he cast doubt on the legitimacy of the system, both in terms of the result, but also threatening to jail his opponent. I mean, this was a language and a style utterly different from anything we've seen, coming on top of the fact that America has for the first time elected a man to the White House who has no previous government or military experience. That's the first time in the history of the Republic.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Trump was such a sort of blizzard that occasionally you had to try and step back and say, well, hang on, why am I so shocked by this? I certainly was. And for me, it was many things, but the worst really was the embrace of really wild conspiracy theories that you don't want a presidential candidate, let alone a president, doing. I remember there was a moment when, remember Judge Antonin Scalia, the Supreme Court Justice, died.
Brilliant conservative intellectual.
Absolutely, and a big blow to conservatives because they were worried about the balance of the Supreme Court. But then Trump, that a couple of days later, said, well, there are rumors that he was murdered, that he was found with a pillow over his face. I mean, this is crazy stuff. It's the kind of thing you might hear on talk radio at sort of 2 a.m. But for a Republican candidate and now president to be saying that was, I think, an example of a kind of style of politics where he didn't really appear to care much whether things were true or not, just whether they appealed to his base and whether they stoked them up. And, again, I said I was just in Washington. One of the people there, who's a kind of scion of the American foreign policy establishment, said that he worried that Trump would carry this style into government, and that what he called the big lie would become part of his style of governing and even of American foreign policy.
Do you think it might also encourage other, if you like, celebrities to now think that you can get to the White House and become the president of the most powerful country on earth just by being a celebrity? I mean, Kanye West for president in 2020? Or
look, anything's possible. I mean, I think one of the interesting things is
because he's rewritten the rules, hasn't
completely.
he? Everything that you and I would say about, well, this it's very unlikely, he won't win the majority in the electoral college.
Political scientists had this whole theory that the party decides, and that outsiders can never do it, and so on. So we're trying to figure out what happened, and is this to do with social media, for example? Has that ripped up the old rules of politics and created a kind of echo chambers where people really only listen to confirmatory views? Somebody said to me that we've moved from a world where voters ask, is this true or false, to a world of like-dislike, the Facebook thing. Do I like this news or do I dislike it? They're just looking for things that confirm their prejudices. And that is pretty worrying. And I think and celebrity, as you say, is another huge currency which Trump used, his television career and so on. The fact that he was well known was obviously important.
Opinion certainly trumped fact, so to speak, in 2016. What about, brief word on Brexit? I mean, was this another irrational, or not another, but was this an irrational spasm, or was it a logical decision taken by the majority of the people to say the current arrangement with the European Union with the UK is unsatisfactory and we need something totally different? In other words, another big repudiation of the status quo.
Look, I mean, maybe it's just me being defensive about Britain because after all I'm from here. I personally don't think it's quite as bizarre a decision as electing Donald Trump president. I opposed it. I think it's a big mistake, and I think Britain will suffer for it. But I think I could see the arguments on the other side. And there were, reputable conservative intellectuals, for example, who were in favour of Brexit.
The constitutionalists, so to speak.
Yeah, and I struggle to find any reputable conservative intellectuals who backed Donald Trump.
Okay, let's go back to 2000. Look at 2016-17 on the year of the demagogue. It's also the year of the strongmen. It was good. They had a good year. Mr. Erdogan in Turkey, Mr. Putin in Russia, arguably making advances in Syria. President Xi, now core leader in China, and even Mr. Modi in India.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the interesting things is that, we used to think that the outside world was perhaps following political patterns set in the West, certainly after 1989, that they were going to emulate our politics. And I think what's happened is that a kind of developing world style of politics has actually entered the West, so that you have people like Erdogan and Putin have a kind of political style that you're now seeing replicated to some extent by Donald Trump, which is very much a leader cult, dividing society into enemies and friends. And yes, that strongman politics does seem to be the flavour of the period. And oddly, Putin really is the archetype of it. And so I don't think it's an accident that Donald Trump has expressed such admiration for Vladimir Putin.
One reason perhaps being the increasing emphasis on security, threat from radical Islamic terrorism. Gideon, I think we may be looking then, at least in the short term, 2017 as the year of illiberal democracy, barring any upsets.
Yeah, well, it's going to be a big test in Europe because there are 3 big elections coming up in the Netherlands, in France and in Germany, and I think those will set the tone of politics, at least in the Western world.
Gideon Rachman, thank you so much.